Oh, hi! As mentioned in last episode's outro, I'm breaking parts which cover a broad subject matter, like for instance a given period in the planet's natural history, apart into individual episodes on one or a few related clades. And do note that in this case, related doesn't necessarily mean taxonomically related, it just means they are associated or similar in a way that justifies handling them together. And once all episodes in a given part are done, I'll compile them into a season episode, which is more like what you get from the Biblarians or Depretiners of the world. In this part 2, I'll cover the kingdoms, incredibly broad groups where all members share fundamental traits. Some well known examples are plants, animals, and fungi, and phylums, broad clades that all have important, possibly even somewhat gimmicky traits in common, such as chordates with growable internal skeletons, arthropods with exoskeletons, and Cnidaria with deadly stinging cells. I also desire to mention that in online spec bio, a common piece of wisdom you see shared around is that you should only have two phylums plus autotrophs for simplicity. Don't listen to this. I speak from personal experience when I say that it leads to problems down the road, and my miserable attempts to fix those problems were one of the two main reasons, from which everything else stems, that I abandoned the 1.0 version of this project. I personally now go for 6 animal phyla, plus plants slash autotrophs, plus basal life forms, since I'm an absolute spec bio junkie, but all you need is 2 motile phylums, plus autotrophs, plus a sessile phylum. Then you're free to add more stuff atop that if you choose. But what I just outlined is the minimum. Do not go below that, although I admittedly have no way of stopping you. Regardless of how life came about on Earth, here on Emigin, it started from self-replicating proteins in a hydrothermal vent. And viruses exist, having began as self-replicating proteins that adapted to get resources from other self-replicating proteins. And going back to said self-replicating proteins, they in response developed a cell membrane for defense, and inside that, they also have ribosomes and cytoplasm. I'll call this kingdom Unis Pels, or One Skin. Correction, it's pronounced Unus Pelis. But anyway, since their cell membrane does pretty much nothing but control what chemicals can and cannot enter the organism for more protection, they may evolve a proper cell wall, and for that, I'll call these organisms duplicicute, or double skin. And also, a cell capsule is an external organelle which goes on top of the cell wall that is used to manipulate their environment, similar to the arms of centauristic tetrapods. You know, the tentacles and spikes on the surface of some bacteria, that's the cell capsule. So anyway, a clade of duplicicute may develop a cell capsule. I'll call this clade triplexcutis, or triple skin. Another group are the Autonians, which have specialized organelles that can metabolize non-carbon, inorganic chemicals, though most can resort to heterotrophy if necessary. Most clades aren't very diverse due to a lack of inorganic compounds in most areas, with two exceptions. One of the most advanced clades of Autonians that break down rocks, which I call Lithonians, and these have colonial forms as well, as some of the most basal Autonians, so basal that they actually metabolize an organic compound, CO2, using sunlight, their phototrophs, thus warranting the name Photonians. Both bacterial forms and colonial slash multicellular forms have a vascule for storing sugar to survive the night. A clade of these so-called photonians may evolve multicellularity. There will be algae and kelp-like plants, both of which need access to the atmosphere to obtain CO2 for photosynthesis, which the algae will achieve by straight up living right up there at the surface, and the kelp will achieve by growing up to the surface. And also, a common misconception is that plants must be green for photosynthesis. In reality, they can be a huge variety of colors. Just look at Susan Fellies and their coral hosts, with all their many colors used for photosynthesis. Pretty much any color will work, Though, do bear in mind that they will tend towards darker shades of the colors they use, because they absorb more light as opposed to brighter shades which reflect more light. So, with all that explained, I'll have blue plants on my alien planet. I'll call this kingdom Cyanophyta, or blue plants. In ancient Greek this time, not Latin. And yes, I am just now realizing that I've yet to give any clades a name in the series, so it's not any kind of twist. Deal with it. A single kelp plant on this planet isn't actually one, but in fact a colony of organisms with a central pillar, which I'll call a monarch, supporting them, bringing CO2 to the leaves which aren't near the surface. And each leaf is its own individual organism, except for the monarch, where they have 2 to 6 leaves of their own, described as the crown, at the top of the organism, as well as 4 gametangia, which are used to release fertilized spores and hold unfertilized spores, and release pollen. And each leaf also has its own gametangia, where it makes seeds or pollen, which get taken to the monarch's gametangia to be used appropriately. Pollen is released and hopefully will reach another monarch's gametangia and fertilize a spore. If it is a monarch, once its status has been determined, it will take another 5 local weeks to give it the nutrients it will need to grow to the surface without starving first. Or it will be a leaf and simply be released and hopefully land on another colony and grow. Since this is unlikely to happen any given time, they will make many spores and release them into the water so some may survive. And lastly, monarchs are also either male or female themselves and may be referred to as king or queen accordingly. I'll call these organisms filiae plantae, or village plants, and it will be replacing the term kelp from now on. And the same goes for the more basic lunar plantae, or loner plants, which will replace the word algae, albeit I will frequently refer to them as such. And this is a good time to note that loner plantae are technically not multicellular, but instead colonial organisms, but they're all under one phylum, Cyanophyta, since evolution doesn't make a point of conforming to human social constructs, believe it or not. Oh, and this is also probably a good time to mention that I'm using Google Translate Latin for the name origins of basically everything in this series. Google Translate's not known for being very accurate, and I'm probably gonna butcher the pronunciations, even if Google gets it right, so bear that in mind. Oh, and the ancient Greek stuff is going off of stuff I've picked up, which could very well be very wrong. So, and I'm almost certainly not pronouncing it right, so, yeah. There's also a clade of bacteria related to the Autonians, which have an organelle that serves as a frugut going through the side, no symmetry, and they also have organelles at the front of the digestive tract that function similar to the cell capsules of Triplex cutis, but only in one spot and on another spot on the side in most forms. These evolved from a flagellum at the end of the cell used to move around. I'll call these forms brachium cellula, or arm cells. And this kept being changed to love your arm when I moved it back and forth between English and Latin in Google Translate. So take this with a grain of salt, lol. And on the other side of the slime mold of life, there are some heterotrophs very similar to Duplicicute. At one point, 2 of the same species both had holes torn in their side, and as they were closing their respective holes, they got pushed together by 2 larger Autonians trying to mate, and this connected their holes, causing them to fuse into one cell. Also, I will note that, sad to say, the Autonians did not get their fun. But as I was saying, they became one cell, though with 2 nucleoids, and they then developed an organelle that connects them, and having 2 nucleoids makes them less vulnerable to viruses, since if one is taken out, they can rely on the other nucleoid and eventually replace the lost one. Doing this does require they break the organelle that connects them whenever the cell membrane is violated unexpectedly.
And they also have a internal membrane to quarantine the other side of the cell from the one being attacked, as well as allowing it to survive while it rebuilds. And they also have a proper nucleus to further protect them from viral infection. I'll call these forms
Duplici cerebrum. At some point relatively early in the planet's natural history, a clade of Duplici cerebrum began operating cooperatively as colonial organisms. These colonies formed small plates on the seafloor, and thus I will call these organisms placozoans, or plate animals. Again in bad ancient Greek. I swear, Google Translate Latin is the standard for this series. But anyway, they'll become multicellular organisms when they develop a softish pole to stand up on. I'll call this the main body, and having this feature will make them much better at filter feeding. This will take these placozoans from being a small niche group of early heterotrophs to a widespread clade found all over the planet's oceans. And furthermore, some forms may evolve fat, others may begin using sexual reproduction, but they will only become true animals when they develop muscles to more accurately get at food particles. I'll call this phylum Radiozoa or circle animals. It'll make sense later, I promise. Again in bad ancient Greek. And they will fill analogous niches to animals on Earth. This kingdom is to be defined as multicellular heterotrophic organisms with a main body and a frill-like feeding structure with fat and muscles from planet Emigin. And the ancestral forms don't have sexual reproduction, though many clades of Radiozoa will. And Placozoa is just a group of colonial heterotrophs from planet Emigin. And I'll describe all forms in between these two extremes as protozoans, which technically means early animals, but let's be honest, I'm using the early 21st century English meaning of the word, an incomplete form of something. So the name really means incomplete animals, which is a very accurate name to describe them, in my opinion. But it's technically inaccurate, but I already am using bad ancient Greek, so yeah. Oh, by the way, as it turns out, protozoans are actually a clade of organisms in the real world, so to avoid conflict with that, I renamed them to radial zoomorphs, so I'm going to note that here. As mentioned before, all radial zoans thus far feed by standing on a pole using a feeding surface, but some animals may innovate on this design. These animals turned their feeding surface into a set of 8 long feeding arms, since this is better for square cube law, more feeding surface relative to volume. Again, many clades of protozoans will already have evolved this adaptation. Even this is one of 2 clades of animals to develop this adaptation, although it is the first and vastly more successful clade of radial zoans to develop this adaptation. I'll call this clade Emo A Sum Animalibus, or top and bottom animals. It'll make sense once I describe this next clade. So, as radial zoa diversifies, some forms may begin actively moving around their environment. This condition is called motility, in contrast to sessility, the inability to do such. That describes all clades I've introduced so far, save for lunar plantae. On Earth, this resulted in the evolution of bilateral symmetry, but it doesn't have to happen the same way on this alien planet. One hypothesis as to how this happened is on Earth, radial symmetry evolved when animals developed a distinct top and bottom, and the body revolved around this one-dimensional line of symmetry. And they developed bilateral symmetry when they developed a distinct front and back. This is tied to motility since having a front is good for some reason. We don't quite know why. It might be that it gives you a forward direction to move in, or that you can be more aerodynamic / need fewer propulsion devices. And civilization probably plays a big role in this too. On Earth, they simply developed a totally new axis of their body, but on this alien planet, they may instead turn their top and bottom into a front and back, making them into organisms without a distinct top or bottom. All of this will have numerous ramifications for their anatomy, which I will get into as they come up. I'll call this clade Frontum Tergum Animalibus. That pronunciation was particularly horrible, or front and back animals, and I will describe their novel condition as front and back radial symmetry, and there is the explanation for the last clade's name. Their names are juxtaposed to each other, and this is also why the name for the kingdom is Radialzoa, since they are all radially symmetrical. I was originally calling them Xenozoa, but that name was too likely to be converged on. As Frontum Echtergum animalibus diversifies, some clades may evolve to feed on the detritus that ended up beneath the soil at the bottom of the ocean. They developed a segmented body plan and reduced the feeding surface into a simple flap on the front of their body, which is used to pull sediment into their body. It will then be passed through the newly developed gut cavity, coming out to the other end of the animal. They also developed scent organs in their flap to determine what is and isn't edible. They also bear a stinger through which they emit various pheromones for identification and signaling things like "I'm being eaten" or "I want to mate." Oh, and they now have sexual reproduction. The gametes, sex cells, are kept in glands next to the hormone glands in the last segment, and it's also worth noting that these glands first developed for reproductive purposes. I'll call this phylum Pterum eruntvermes, or groundworms. As Pterum eruntvermes breaks up the rocks Imamo et Sumo Animalibus was able to sit on into soil, they will need to develop a more proactive way to hold on to this looser ground. So, they may develop 4 more limbs to stick to the ground with suction cups. Again, to feed, they use 8 limbs to filter feed and breathe. And do note that they also have hairs on the ends of the arms for the sake of more filter feeding space, more surface area, all that. Though I'm not showing that for the sake of simplicity. Same goes for the fact I'm only showing 4 feeding arms as opposed to the whole 8. And at their top is the release hole from which they expel feces, and they will also release something else from this hole. Sex cells. They use an overall system of broadcast spawning very similar to the Villae plantae, where they release gametes of their sex into the currents and hope that they encounter a gamete of the opposite sex and fertilize. I'll call this phylum Stellipides, or starfeet, as opposed to the anapods, or no feet, again in ancient Greek. And a branch of Stellipides may adapt their suction cups into small limbs on the bottom of their legs, which they may use to move around the seafloor. And they may evolve a mouth leading to a blind gut separate to their feeding arms and existing excretion system. They'll consume detritus, and with this new food source, they may lose half their feeding arms, leaving them with only 4 arms. So they are now motile, but they are still not very mobile. So I'll call this phylum Il Versa Stella, or the shifting stars, as opposed to the original Suctespides, or suction feet. At some point, a clade of Fronten Echtergum animalibus evolved to float in the water. They achieved this by duplicating their feeding surface at the other end of the organism, and widened it, forming a surface that's pulled on by the currents. I'll call this organ the kite. And like Emo, Sumo, Animalibus, they developed feeding arms, in this case using them to bring food inside the gut, created by moving their feeding surface inside the body. I'll call this phylum Milvus Animalibus, or kite animals. So in conclusion, they use their kites to float through the surface, and a blind gut which they bring smaller plankton into, with feeding arms to survive. And for defense, they spew tons of offspring all the time, similar to insects or krill on Earth. Among them are loner plantae and small heterotrophs called macrobacteria, which I'll get into in a minute. Earlier, I mentioned organisms called macrobacteria. Well, that's what I named them anyway. These organisms evolved from placozoans around 47 million years before the first protozoans, name update pending, appeared. When a clade of placozoans began floating freely in the water, they developed their body more thick and less flat so they will be less easily torn apart. And they also developed a single large eye to detect light, and they also wriggle around a bit to manipulate their movement, though no true musculature. I've called these organisms macrobacteria since they basically live like big bacteria. and I'm going to continue doing that. The ancestral forms live in the benthic zone and fit in the palm of one's hand, though some forms down here grow big enough to barely fit in a large human hand. The most successful forms are plankton that live in the pelagic zone, feeding on autotrophs. Like lunar plantae, filling analogous niches to zooplankton on Earth. However, various forms of these organisms may live in all aquatic ecosystems across the planet, including freshwater and shallow water ecosystems. Reproduction. Ancestrally, they do so whenever it's possible to do so while still having a decent amount of energy left over to live off of for some time. They will reproduce asexually, and pelagic forms, having little defense against predators, will even be more aggressive about this, making young whenever possible, even self-detrimentally sometimes. Counterwise, some forms may produce sperm, which they exchange with others upon collision, which then get used to fertilize an egg. These forms also spread all over Emigin's ecosystems, following the trends of those ecosystems as they do. Other forms may broadcast spawn, similar to the anapods. And do note that the collision spawners are both sexes at once, and both fertilize and get fertilized in all matings, whereas the broadcast spawners have two sexes and are and release gametes that are one or the other. If that phrasing at the end there made sense anyway. Defense. As mentioned before, the pelagic species defend themselves through large numbers, but the many larger forms will utilize a myriad of other mechanisms to protect themselves. Larger forms utilize poison and develop a green aposematic color pattern to signify their danger, but only forms big enough to be clearly seen. Otherwise, predators will just eat them anyway, defeating the point of the toxins. So smaller forms may invest in, well, I would say more personally active means of defense, but well, so just more active means of defense. Okay. Some forms may develop the ability to shoot out a bunch of cells as a threat, and more importantly, as a desperate last resort to propel themselves away from danger. It is a really desperate escape, though, as this can do serious, even lethal harm to the user, even if they can recover due to their simplicity, and this attack may also include toxins that stun, daze, confuse, or otherwise decapacitate the threat. And do note that I use the word threat, since while there are predators purposefully trying to eat them, there's also quite a serious risk of organisms that eat, say, other radial zoans ingesting them by accident, and hardly even noticing, if at all. And so some forms may develop hard armor to defend themselves from active attack, specifically armor that can withstand the radial zoan's digestive tract, which I will get into the implications of near the start of part 3, but anyway, they may form this armor by instead of jettisoning dead cells, using them to form a chitinous structure on their surface, with transparency around the eye. This may also prompt them to develop a dedicated mouth hole, which they can open and close as opposed to just taking in nutrients anywhere on their body, though do note that this is just a hole on their shell and thus does not exist in juveniles. And this hard shell will preclude them from using their existing methods of sexual reproduction. The line that led to these forms had sexual reproduction, but due to this issue, one clade may drop it altogether. And while on said topic, I will also note that it's a common adaptation among sexual macrobacteria to drop it in the name of reproductive speed, since they're highly R-selected. This is the section on defense. That was a tangent, pardon me. But another clade of these may develop a new way to do the deed, to get around their shell, i.e. broadcast spawning, and I just realized I already mentioned that being a thing. These do that for a specific reason, though. Niches. As mentioned before, there are many forms which fill the niches of plankton, but there are also many generalists and decomposers among their ranks. And there are detritivorous benthic forms which burrow by vibrating their body. These are also the biggest macrobacteria anywhere on the planet to support the sediment above them. This also provides a means of defense. However, this method of burrowing does take quite a while, and their movement isn't exactly precise enough to quickly scramble into a pre-made burrow without something going wrong. So this may lead them to a new method of defense where they vibrate straight downwards to the side to jump over the predator. As you can see, this image depicts that very thing happening to a now very confused early member of a lineage of Frontenachtergum animalibus, which I will dive into in an upcoming episode. On an unrelated note, at some point vaguely early in the history of motility, a group of Frontenachtergum animalibus first began putting their frill on sessile radial zoomorphs to metabolize them. To travel greater distances, they may begin actively swimming by paddling with their feeding surface, similar to Milvus animalibus. As time goes on, to move faster, they may develop segmentation to get more feeding surfaces to paddle with, though only the first one works as a feeding surface. And to move nutrients around the body, they developed a hemocoel. And for more efficient movement, they may adapt their non-front feeding surfaces into pedals for more hydrodynamicity. And to see what they're doing, seeing as they swim, not touching the ground, they may develop their eyes. These started out fairly simple, but being large predators, they're subject to selection for more advanced sight, and so they may develop many eyes and cluster them together, forming compound eyes, similar to those of arthropods. However, since they're radially symmetrical, they can't just have their brain to the side of their gut, and they don't need four esophagi, and that would force them to break down their food more than is practical for them right now, so the solution they'll resort to will be turning their brain into a ring. If you were paying close attention more than a month ago, you'll have noticed that this feature is also found in Pteram errant vermes. They also excrete various substances such as poo and gametes through a hole at the back of the digestive tract, so with all that, I'll call these forms octodentes, or eight fangs. Another group of animals will need to evolve to eat the ville plantae, so this phylum will need to be able to swim, so this niche may be filled by forms related to the octodentes, possibly serving as their principal source of prey, i.e. the stuff they initially evolved to eat, and thus mean that they came first. They actually emerged right after they evolved segmentation. They convergently evolved a hemocoel, but this one is different, being that the octodente spawns oxygen to iron to move oxygen around the body, thus giving their blood and flesh a red coloration, whereas these forms use copper-based blood, giving them a bluish-green blood and flesh. They then developed a digestive tract and turned their existing feeding surface into a flap with teeth set up like scissors to cut up leaves. To see what they're doing, they also developed simple eyes. Then once octodentes evolved, they turned their other feeding surfaces into petals similar to octodentes for the same reason. And to see predators approaching, they put their eyes on limbs of their own, which also enables them to move said eyes around. And they also have a fake leaf as a tail for camouflage. I'll call this clade dentes incisuras, or cutting teeth. Due to their copper-based blood, their flesh appears bluish-green, which they use to camouflage, but this will favor the ville plantae, adapting their color to make the dentes incisuras contrast with them, leading dentes incisuras to develop pigment for camo. I'll call the group containing both dentes incisuras and octodentes nature animalibus, or swim animals. So, it's finally done. I have finally, after over a year of work, finished the Planet Emigin Natural History Part 2 season episode. So yeah, here's the burning question. Why the fuck did it take so long? So, in short, basically, with these season episodes, I'm working on this with the motto. Basically, I want it to feel like it was originally just a 30-minute speculative biology video, as opposed to what's it like in this case, 7 episodes composing a season of a series, which is how it was actually produced. That was the whole idea of the season episodes, and quite a lot in parts 2. I ended up basically I'd go in and I'd say in the next episode, or in this episode, and every time that happened, because of this little principle, I had to go in, edit that out, and then create new audio that's where I say, oh, later, or right now, or whatever, right? Which was a pain in the ass to make that fit in and sound natural with the original audio of the various videos.
So that was a big headache, and that was such a big headache that it ended up leading to just getting delayed for over a year. But it's over a year, which is also why it's not going to take nearly as long for the other season episodes to come out. The current plan is for at least the part 3 season episode to come out in January, and theoretically it makes sense for the part 5 and part 4 and 5 season episodes to also come out in January because they do not have the same blockage. In the case of the poor, but here's the thing, with these thumbnails I'm making for the season episodes, like on this one and the previous one, they're very much very big. They're big projects I spent weeks working on, and I finished the one for part 4, then it got ruined, so I have to remake it. And the part 5 one is planned to be very similar, and so it's like this is gonna be a pain in the ass to draw. They take weeks to do. They're a massive amount of effort. So, yeah, that might end up delaying those into February. Also, I'd like to note that when I detached the original audio from the footage it's associated with, like the audio from old videos, if I detached the audio from the footage it's associated with to do something with it separate to the footage, it would automatically like quiet down the start and the end of it. There's not much I could do about it. If I stretched it out, it would have the stuff from that I didn't want to show in the audio from before when it's supposed to cut out, and if I didn't do it, then the first word or so would be all whispery and quiet like that. There's not much I could do about it besides recreate the audio and recreate its original shittiness, and at that point it's like, why not just give it the part one redone treatment, which is not what this is supposed to be, and it's way more than I signed up to do. So no, that's not happening, and yeah. But yeah, but anyway, regarding how this timed out, it's on one hand, it's like it's kind of good, but it makes for a big final blowout for the year I can release right after Christmas when the big shots stop uploading. On the other hand, it's also the case that with this episode that basically, well, how do I put it? A year ago, the YouTube algorithm really favored long videos like this, so this would have been really good for it at the time. This would have really grown my channel. And it still is kind of like that, but not to the same extent. So it kind of sucks, but also, hey, here it is. And well, if we're gonna take this video as the last final blowout for the year, because this is that video I just realized. If we're gonna take it as that, then well, here's the thing. I'm gonna tell you some stuff about the upcoming year on this channel and my second channel. So again, I'm planning to have a big blowout, release a ton of stuff throughout January to try and grow both channels. So that's a thing that's happening. On top of that, Caveman Land's also going along quite strongly right now. To the point where in 2023 I plan to release a couple trailers for it. The first one will be in January, and yeah, it's gonna be very vague. It's more or less a bunch of concept art, but there's gonna be some less vague trailers later into the year, so keep an eye out for that. Then also, I finally got stuff's finally progressing along, so stuff's getting repaired, and soon enough I should be finally able to make more pen videos again. I know I promised a new one by the end of November. Yeah, that didn't end up working out, but hey, by the end of January or at some point in February, it should finally happen. So that's great, isn't it? But yeah, and then that should keep going. Admittedly, I planned this will be the first episode of part 6, which is a fairly long part, and I may or may not have been planning to be midway through part 7 on the first episode I release in 2023. But hey, stuff goes along at the pace it goes along at. So yeah, I mean, I've got a whole lot of stuff to do. I've got a whole lot of videos to make. Still have to make most of the big January wave. I'm making this relatively early in December, a bit before it went up on YouTube for you all to see. But yeah, that's how this is going. I'm very proud to have this finished. I'm very excited to have it be the case that you can go out and just see this sitting on YouTube at the end of the part 2 playlist. That'll be the first playlist that is finished. And on top of that, it also means that I could also make a season episodes playlist finally after 6 months of waiting to when I made part 1 redone. Yay! So, yeah, this is good. I'm just rambling on now, wasting your time, aren't I? I guess you should finish this little outro. Well, you've all been watching for the last 30 minutes if you're seeing this. Thank you. Mwah. Yeah, nothing else to say in terms of hard promises I'm willing to make. So, goodbye. Have a good day. Have a happy new year. Uh, have a good hangover day. So yeah, have a good happy new year. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. No, not Merry Christmas. That's in the past. Happy New Year. Mwah. Bye.